scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George were playing in their bedroom. The toys scattered across the floor seemed perfectly normal, but something felt different tonight. The shadows in the corners appeared darker than usual, and the familiar sounds of the house had fallen into an unsettling silence. Peppa noticed that her favorite teddy bear was sitting in a strange position, its button eyes seeming to follow her movements. When she blinked, the bear appeared to have moved slightly closer to the edge of the bed. George, clutching his dinosaur toy, whispered that he heard strange scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. As the night grew deeper, the children's room began to transform. The cheerful wallpaper started to peel at the edges, revealing something dark and twisted underneath. The colorful drawings on the walls began to change, their innocent smiles turning into sinister grins with too many teeth. Mummy Pig called from downstairs, but her voice sounded hollow and distant, as if it was coming from somewhere far away. When Peppa tried to respond, no sound came from her mouth. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock that wasn't there before. The toys around them started to move on their own. Blocks rearranged themselves into disturbing patterns, and the rocking horse began to rock back and forth without anyone touching it. George's dinosaur toy let out a low, unnatural growl that made both children freeze in terror. Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked open, but nobody was there. A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the night light and plunging everything into darkness. In the blackness, they could hear footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. When the lights flickered back on, the room had completely changed. The walls were now covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. The mirror on the dresser showed not their reflection, but something else entirely: shadowy figures with glowing eyes watching them from the other side. Peppa reached for George's hand, but when she looked at him, his familiar face had changed. His eyes had become completely black, and when he smiled, rows of sharp teeth gleamed in the dim light. He spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, asking if she wanted to play a new game that would last forever. The house itself seemed to be alive now, breathing and shifting around them. The floorboards creaked and groaned as if something massive was moving beneath them. The windows showed not the familiar garden outside, but an endless void filled with swirling darkness and distant, haunting whispers. As Peppa tried to run toward the door, she realized that the hallway beyond had stretched impossibly long, with doors leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. Each door she passed whispered her name, inviting her to come inside and never leave. The familiar yellow house had become a maze of nightmares, and there was no way out. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The day started like any other at Peppa's playgroup, but something was terribly wrong from the very beginning. When Peppa arrived at the classroom, she noticed that all the other children were sitting perfectly still in their chairs, facing forward with their hands folded neatly on their desks. Nobody was talking, nobody was playing, and nobody even turned to look when she walked in. Madame Gazelle stood at the front of the classroom with her back to the children, writing something on the blackboard that Peppa couldn't quite make out. The writing seemed to move and shift whenever she tried to focus on it, like it was written in a language that her eyes couldn't properly see. When Madame Gazelle finally turned around, her usual warm smile had been replaced by something that stretched far too wide across her face, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to go on forever. Pedro Pony was the first to turn his head toward Peppa, but when he did, she saw that his eyes had been replaced by two perfect black circles that seemed to absorb all the light around them. One by one, the other children began to turn their heads in the same mechanical way, each revealing the same empty black voids where their eyes should have been. Their mouths all opened at exactly the same time, and they began to speak in perfect unison, their voices creating a horrible harmony that made Peppa's skin crawl. They were reciting something that sounded like a nursery rhyme, but the words were all wrong. Instead of the cheerful songs they usually sang, they chanted about dark places where lost children go, about shadows that follow you home, and about games that never end once you start playing them. The rhythm was hypnotic and terrifying, and Peppa found herself wanting to join in even though every instinct told her to run. The classroom itself began to change as the chanting continued. The bright, colorful walls started to fade to a sickly gray color, and the cheerful drawings and posters began to peel away like old skin. The windows, which should have shown the sunny playground outside, now revealed only an endless black void that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The toys and books scattered around the room began to move on their own, arranging themselves into strange patterns that hurt to look at directly. Peppa tried to back toward the door, but when she turned around, she discovered that the door had vanished completely. Where it should have been, there was now just another wall covered in the same peeling gray paint. She was trapped in this nightmare classroom with her transformed friends and their terrifying teacher, and there was no way out. Madame Gazelle began to approach Peppa with that impossible smile still stretching across her face. With each step she took, she seemed to grow taller and thinner, her limbs stretching like rubber until she looked more like a spider than a person. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where the sound was actually coming from. She told Peppa that it was time for a very special lesson, one that would teach her about the true nature of friendship and belonging. The other children stopped their chanting and began to stand up from their chairs, moving in the same jerky, unnatural way. They formed a circle around Peppa, their black eyes never blinking, their mouths still curved in those horrible smiles that mirrored their teachers. The lesson, Madame Gazelle explained, was about becoming part of something bigger than yourself. It was about letting go of the things that made you different and embracing the beautiful uniformity that would make everyone the same. As she spoke, Peppa began to feel a strange tingling sensation in her eyes, and when she looked down at her reflection in a puddle that had mysteriously appeared on the floor, she saw that her own eyes were beginning to darken around the edges. The transformation was starting, and Peppa realized with growing horror that soon she would be just like all the others. She would sit in her chair with perfect posture, chant the dark nursery rhymes, and wait for the next new student to arrive so that the lesson could begin all over again. The playgroup would continue forever, with new children joining their ranks one by one, until everyone in the world had learned the same terrible lesson about belonging. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the window, and everything seemed normal. Mummy Pig called them down for breakfast, her voice echoing strangely through the house. As they walked down the stairs, Peppa noticed something odd about the family photos on the wall. The faces in the pictures seemed to be watching them, following their every movement with unblinking eyes. In the kitchen, Daddy Pig was sitting at the table reading his newspaper, but when he looked up to greet them, his smile was too wide, stretching impossibly across his face. His eyes had turned completely black, like deep holes in his head. Mummy Pig served them breakfast with jerky, mechanical movements, her head tilting at unnatural angles as she moved around the kitchen. George started crying, but instead of his usual tears, thick black liquid poured from his eyes. Peppa tried to comfort him, but when she touched his shoulder, her hand passed right through him as if he were made of mist. The kitchen began to grow darker, even though the sun was still shining outside. The shadows on the walls started moving on their own, creeping closer to the children. Suddenly, all the toys in the house came to life. Teddy bears with razor-sharp teeth crawled down from the shelves, their button eyes glowing red in the dim light. The toy dinosaur that George loved so much grew to enormous size, its plastic jaws snapping hungrily as it stomped through the living room, leaving deep cracks in the floor with each step. Peppa grabbed George's hand and they ran upstairs, but the house seemed to stretch endlessly. The hallway grew longer and longer, with doors appearing and disappearing along the walls. Behind each door, they could hear whispers calling their names in voices that sounded almost like their friends, but wrong somehow, distorted and hollow. They finally reached their bedroom and slammed the door shut, but when they turned around, the room had changed completely. The walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse and writhe like living things. Their beds had transformed into gaping mouths with rows of sharp teeth, breathing heavily and waiting to swallow them whole. Outside their window, instead of their familiar garden. There was an endless void filled with floating eyes that blinked in unison. The eyes belonged to all their friends from playgroup, but their faces were twisted into expressions of pure terror. Susie Sheep's wool had turned black as coal, and her eyes had become empty sockets that seemed to stare directly into their souls. The children huddled together in the corner as the room began to spin around them. The furniture melted like wax, dripping onto the floor and forming puddles that reflected images of their worst nightmares. In the mirrors, they could see themselves, but their reflections were smiling even though they were terrified, and their reflection selves began to move independently, reaching out from the glass as if trying to pull them in. As the nightmare reached its peak, everything suddenly stopped. The room returned to normal, the sun was shining, and Mummy Pig was calling them for breakfast again. But when Peppa looked at George, she noticed that his reflection in the window was still smiling that terrible smile, even though George himself looked perfectly normal. And in the corner of her eye, she could swear she saw one of the toys move just slightly, as if it were still watching and waiting for the right moment to come alive again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George decided to play hide and seek in their house. The familiar yellow walls seemed different tonight, casting strange shadows that moved without any source of light. Peppa counted to 10 while George ran to find the perfect hiding spot. But when she opened her eyes, something was terribly wrong. The house felt bigger than before, with corridors that stretched endlessly into darkness. Peppa called for George, but her voice echoed back distorted, as if someone else was speaking her words. She walked through the living room where the purple furniture had turned a sickly shade of gray, and the family photos on the walls showed faces she didn't recognize. In the kitchen, Mummy Pig was cooking dinner, but she stood perfectly still, her back turned to Peppa. When Peppa approached and touched her shoulder, Mummy Pig slowly turned around. Her usual warm smile had been replaced by a wide grin that stretched too far across her face, revealing rows of sharp teeth that glinted in the dim light. Peppa ran upstairs to find Daddy Pig reading his newspaper in the bedroom. But as she got closer, she realized he wasn't reading at all. His eyes were completely black, staring at a newspaper with no words, just endless rows of tiny, moving dots that seemed to crawl across the pages like insects. The sound of George crying came from somewhere deep in the house. Peppa followed the sound through rooms that kept changing shape, walls that breathed like living things, and doors that led to places that shouldn't exist. The crying grew louder and more desperate with each step. Finally, she found George in what used to be their playroom, but now it was filled with toys that moved on their own. The red car drove in circles without anyone touching it. The teddy bear's button eyes followed Peppa wherever she went, and the dinosaur toy that George loved so much had grown real teeth and was making hungry growling sounds. George sat in the corner, but he wasn't crying anymore. He was laughing, a sound that was too deep and too old for a little pig. When he turned to look at Peppa, his eyes had become mirrors, reflecting not Peppa's face, but the face of something else entirely, something that had been waiting in the house all along. The walls began to close in, and Peppa realized that this wasn't her house anymore. It never had been. She had been playing hide and seek, but she was the one who had been found. The real Peppa, the real George, the real family were somewhere else, still looking for the children who had disappeared into a house that existed between the spaces of the real world. As the darkness swallowed everything, the last thing Peppa heard was the sound of her own voice, calling from somewhere far away, still counting to 10, still waiting for a game that would never end. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. As she walked downstairs for breakfast, she noticed that all the family photos on the wall had changed. In every picture, the faces were smiling, but their eyes were completely black, staring directly at her. George was already sitting at the breakfast table, but he wasn't his usual cheerful self. His pink skin had an odd grayish tint, and when he looked up at Peppa, his smile stretched too wide across his face. Mummy Pig was cooking at the stove, humming a tune that Peppa had never heard before. The melody was haunting and seemed to echo through the house even when Mummy Pig stopped humming. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper, but the pages were completely blank. He turned each empty page with great interest, occasionally chuckling at nothing. When Peppa asked him what was so funny, he looked at her with those same black eyes from the photographs and said in a voice that didn't sound quite right, "Everything is perfectly normal, Peppa. Nothing has changed at all." At school, things became even stranger. All of Peppa's friends were there, but they moved in perfect synchronization, like they were all following the same invisible script. Susie Sheep spoke in monotone sentences, Rebecca Rabbit's ears twitched in an unnatural rhythm, and Pedro Pony's eyes never blinked. The teacher, Madame Gazelle, wrote lessons on the blackboard, but the words kept changing when no one was. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. But something felt different today. The sunlight streaming through their window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the walls. Peppa noticed that her favorite teddy bear was facing the wrong direction, staring directly at her with its button eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa entered the kitchen, she saw that Mummy Pig was standing perfectly still, her back turned, stirring porridge that had already turned cold. The spoon moved in endless circles, making a scraping sound against the bottom of the pot that sent chills down Peppa's spine. George tried to speak, but no sound came from his mouth. He pointed frantically at the window, where the familiar garden had transformed into something unrecognizable. The trees had grown impossibly tall overnight, their branches twisted into shapes that resembled grasping fingers reaching toward the house. The playground equipment had vanished, replaced by dark holes in the ground that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. Daddy Pig appeared in the doorway, but his glasses reflected nothing but darkness. His usual jolly smile had been replaced by an expression that Peppa had never seen before. When he spoke, his voice echoed as if coming from a deep well, asking if the children wanted to play a new game. The game, he explained, involved finding all the missing neighbors who had disappeared during the night. As they ventured outside, Peppa realized that their street had become a maze of identical houses, each one slightly wrong in ways she couldn't quite explain. The windows were too large, the doors too small, and every house number was the same. The sky above had turned an unsettling shade of green, and clouds moved in perfect geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. They encountered Susie Sheep standing in the middle of the road, but she wasn't moving or blinking. Her wool had turned gray, and when Peppa called her name, Susie's head turned a full circle to face them while her body remained perfectly still. She spoke in a voice that wasn't her own, warning them that the game had already begun, and there was no way to stop playing until everyone was found. The search led them to the school, where all the desks were arranged in a perfect spiral leading to the center of the classroom. Miss Rabbit was there, writing the same word over and over on the blackboard until it covered every inch of the surface. The word was help, but written backwards, and each letter seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. In the final moments, as darkness began to fall despite it being morning, Peppa realized that they weren't looking for missing neighbors at all. They were the ones who had disappeared, trapped in a world that looked like home but felt like a nightmare. The last thing she saw was her own reflection in a puddle, but the reflection was smiling while she was crying, and it waved goodbye as everything faded to black.